Coach for June 10th, 2023.
Let's get ready to podcast.
There it is at that music. It means it's Saturday, and it is time for Ask the Podcast Coach, where you get your podcast questions answered live. I'm Dave Jackson from the School of Podcasting.com, and joining me right over there in a lovely green shirt. What is on this shirt? What is that?
I don't know. It's some racing shirt of some kind. Something I got for our race, whatever.
There you go. Nothing better than free swag. That is Jim Cullison from theaverageguy.tv. Jim, how's it going, buddy?
Greetings, Dave. Happy Saturday morning to you, and happy disc golf morning. I got a whole round of disc golf in this morning before we even got to the show, so I'm feeling extra productive today.
Well, then, now are you tired at all?
Oh, I'm super tired.
There you go.
Let's be clear. I'm not doing anything the rest of the day except drinking some coffee.
There you go. And that coffee, that one right there, is brought to you by our good friend Mark. He said, scrambling for the slides here. Mark from podcastbranding.co. Now, we talk about Mark all the time and how great he is. Now, if you want to see him in the wild, this is kind of like a twin spin. If you go to, I believe it's I should have it in, yes, flamealivepod.com is a newly anointed Mark from podcastbranding.co website. And also, with how great is this? It's an awesome supporter. So if you are looking for like, well, what kind of stuff does this guy do? Just go to flamealivepod.com. That's just one of the many websites he's done. And of course, he is an awesome graphic artist and a podcaster. And so if you are looking to look good, well, go over to podcastbranding.co. Mark will take care of you. And, you got to remember, they're going to see you before they hear you. So check out Mark over at podcastbranding.co.
Take me home.
And that coffee's hot this morning. I think I just pulled it off the stove. Of course, big thanks to our friend Dan Lefebvre over there, based on a true story podcast.com. And if you want to check it out this week, he's covering two movies in his series, The Longest Day and Saving Private Ryan, which could be the same movie, actually, to be honest. It was a long day. The day of Saving Private Ryan was a long day. So check it out if you need a new podcast or you just want to listen to something different. Check it out based on a true story podcast.com. And we thank Dan for his sponsorship.
Awesome.
Always awesome.
Yeah. So, Jim, if I remember right, you had some big event for Gallup coming up last week. Did your ego survive?
It's pretty amazing. I'm not going to lie. I'm famous for 3 days a year. So we get together. The podcast Call to Coach is trending at about 500,000 downloads a year now, which is kind of cool. 250,000 last year, so it's doubled over the last year, which is kind of cool. And so we get these folks together. We had about 800, 900 in person, and then we had 3,000 virtual, which we tried. This is our first year. We tried the hybrid event. So for 4 years, we were in person. 3 years, we were virtual. And I'd always dreamt of being able to have a virtual ticket on this where we did the two together. And the team did a really nice job on nailing virtual. We got so many great comments from folks on Facebook, which you know how people are so nice to you on Facebook. You know that general trend of nice things on Facebook. So we got a lot of great comments of best virtual conference I've ever been to. This was super awesome. Here was the key, Dave, on this, is that we put two moderators in the rooms. So you had a live moderator and you had a virtual moderator, and they worked together to bring in comments and questions from chat that was going on virtual, as well as take care of people in the room. We lit the stages really well so that it wouldn't be some dark, dim, right? We got really good cameras on that thing. And my part was I did the in between the breaks, of each of the sessions.
Right.
Well, when you're at home, you might go to the bathroom or get more coffee, but what do you do during the breaks? When you're in person, you walk around and meet people, whatever. So I brought people on the stage and we interviewed them. We had some conversation. I had the camera facing the hallway, so it kind of felt like
nice.
They were there kind of thing. And I've done this before in this a little bit like this, and it just kind of adds. They could hear the crowd, so we got really good feedback. I must have taken 200 selfies with people, type thing, and everybody I work with just thinks it's nuts because the 362 days the rest of the year, I'm just Jim, the podcast guy. Right. But these 3 days, it's pretty great. So it's pretty good. Good ego boost at Gallup. We say it filled my bucket. Lots of energy coming off of it. My voice is still a little scratchy from it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's pretty cool. Pretty cool.
Yeah. If you ever get a chance to meet one of your listeners, if they don't ask, because sometimes they feel it's weird, like they're bothering you, before they leave, go, hey, you want to take a selfie?
Yeah.
And I learned that from Penn and Teller. Penn and Teller, the famous musicians out in Las Vegas. When you go to a Penn and Teller show, you're going to see them in the lobby because they realized that when you take a selfie with someone, the chances of them sharing that on social is great. And so they'll be like, oh, I got to meet Jim at the, Gallup conference and blah, blah, blah. And so you just got a free plug for your podcast. So it's great. Yeah.
Never had to worry about that, Dave. I folks coming up. If I was alone for more than 10 seconds, it was kind of weird. It was usually coming up in selfies. Question in the chat. What did we use? So Dave, what did they use for the conference software? No Zoom. Zoom's not allowed on those kinds of things for that. It's just, it's okay, but we use webinar.net as our back end. We actually have a team. We've kind of custom built our own. I think Swoogo is part of that platform. And then I use StreamYard for the breaks to go to YouTube, and they just embedded the YouTube videos in the platform. So when they would go to a breakout, they'd click on the breakout, and if they go there early, they would see my video that they could join while they were waiting for that. And then right on time, I would do a minute countdown to give us some buffer, and then the production teams behind it. We had a whole room of producers, which was super cool.
I bet.
Watching this thing behind the scenes, I'd start the timer, and then they would just cut over to the breakout room when they were ready to get that done. It was pretty cool. It worked out pretty well.
Yeah, that's I'm just picturing was there a chat on the I can't imagine a chat with 3,000 people.
It's pretty, but it's pretty the breakout rooms, no, it goes fast. It just does. No matter how you slice it, it just goes super, super fast. But in our chat, you can scroll down and it holds. I think Google, the Google chat does this as well, where if you start scrolling, it won't bring up the new ones. It'll show you there's new comments below, a little comment.
Yeah.
Hey, new comments type deal. So you can kind of stop the chat if you want. Because we do this so much, I have a podcast just about every week, maybe every other week during the summer. We kind of teach them how to use a chat room and not just get chitty chatty. So they'll jump in, and in the very beginning, they're like, "Hey, everybody, coming in from Ontario or coming in from Bellevue, Nebraska, whatever." So they check in, and then they get quiet, and then they start. They kind of know it, and then they'll say hi to each other and that kind of stuff. But once things get started, they do a nice job of not filling it up with junk, I guess is what I'm saying. So they've gotten really good at that. So. Yeah, they're used to it because we do it all the time, right? It's just one of those kind of things. We've just kind of taught them how to do it.
Very cool. Well, we have one of these some of these questions today are interesting. I was out on Reddit, I was looking at Facebook, and I think we're falling back into that habit of overthinking things again. So this one is having guests on a second time. It says my podcast focuses on certain events and in people's lives. And you have those times when you just click really well with a guest, or the story is fascinating. If and / when they do something else similarly, that's noteworthy, I would like to have them to return to talk about the new event. My questions are, A, is doing this a good or all right idea, or would people think it was repetitive? Okay. And if a guest came back on the podcast, how long after the first episode should I leave it? Okay. Relevant information. New episodes are released every 2 weeks. Examples from your own podcast would be great. So when I saw this, it was just like, okay, is this a good idea, or would people think it was repetitive? But he said, if and when they do something else similar but noteworthy, I would like to have them return. So I just saw this as I think I mentioned this. I heard about this on Conan O'Brien when Stephen Wright, who's that totally deadpan, I spilled spot remover on my dog and now I can't find him, comedian. He was on a Monday on Johnny Carson, and then he was liked so much that they had him back on Friday. And I don't think people on Friday were like, hey, what's this guy doing? Is this a repeat? What's going on, Johnny? He was like, no, this guy's funny. Bring him back. So for me, I don't know how long after. To me, I'm just like, if it's good, if you're delivering value to your audience, I just kind of saw this as an overthink. I don't know. What say you, Jim Collison?
Well, sometimes on the Gallup stuff, we get a guest that has too much information.
Yeah.
And so I'll just try to book them as quick as I can. If we get and the hour's up and we got more to say, I'll say, hey, can we come back and finish this in a part 2? And they'll say yes. And then we get them scheduled for a week or 2 or 3 or 4, whatever works in their schedule and ours. We get a schedule. I am absolutely a huge fan of having guests come back.
Yeah.
We think everything has to be original. And if your audience loves the guest, I'd have them on once a quarter. I'd make them regular. Like Erin Lawrence is a great example of this. She lives up in Canada. That's burning down. Sorry about our friends in Canada right now. I know you guys are under a lot of stress right now with all the fires that are going on up there. But she's a blogger. She's a gadget blogger. She's dynamite at what she does. She has a great YouTube channel. For some reason, she likes me. So like she likes coming on the show. So once a quarter, we have Erin Lawrence on, and she brings kind of some regular content. The guys over at thinkcomputers.org, they're systems builders. They love doing that kind of stuff. We have them on probably twice a year. I think it gets the audience used to they become experts for your show. And then they start to learn your audience, which is very cool. So I'm a big fan, Dave. I think sometimes we think it's always got to be a different guest. Listeners like to hear people who are experts and that they like. And if they like that, my audience loves Erin, I'm going to have her on just as much as I can.
Yeah, I was trying to think of how many times. I've had Glenn the Geek on, I think 5 times, to where he'll email me and he kind of knows. He'll like, hey, I think I have something for an episode. And he doesn't even have to say what it is. Right. I just go, yes, because he understands who my audience is. He's never pitched something that I was like, I don't know about that one. So yeah, I'm trying to think if I've had anybody else on more than once, but to me, as long as they deliver value, like Glenn doesn't come back and say, hey, I got an idea. It's about this time where I got a booth at the biggest horse thing. I'm like, yeah, we did that. That would be a no, but he's coming up with new stuff and he's got great insights. Like now I'd love to have him come on and talk about how do you sell your podcast? Because that's what he did. So yeah. And Daniel says, did I ever ask Glenn, tell me a little bit about yourself on the second and third time? That'd be funny.
We always do a callback. So we'll always say, hey, welcome back. I think I had you on last year about this time. Get us caught up a little bit. What's new and interesting so we don't need to know them again, but it's good for the audience for them to catch up. What's been happening? What have they been doing? What's been exciting? Some of those kinds of things.
And you can use that as a marketing too. You can be like, hey, we had Glenn back on episode 457. I'll have a link in the show notes, or of course you can always follow the show at, whatever, askthepodcastcoach.com/follow and never miss an episode. So do that whole 9 yards. And as we record this, I believe John Lee Dumas is going to start a new podcast called Canada on Fire. All right. So
too soon, Dave.
Too soon. Yeah.
Too soon.
But so don't overthink things when it comes to stuff like that. And I just, I think sometimes, I don't know about this, but we get nervous about starting a podcast. Now he's already going. That was the other thing. But I don't know. I think we get too far out of the listener side and too much into the podcaster side. And we start evaluating different things, and we just do it. And let people complain. That's the other one. I'm like, what, if you're not sure if something's going to work, but you think it's going to work, throw it out there. And if they go, yeah, I don't like that. Okay, well then don't do it again. I don't know that I now in today's kind of, what would you call it, environment, there are things you can talk about that people will just leave instantly and maybe unsubscribe because, you know, you don't think like me, but that's all right. We don't want those people. So keep that in mind. We got a question here talking about events. For those who do an in-person podcaster meetup, what is the top 2 things I should be aware of? I'm doing one with our local library that is a great sound booth space. I just moved off of Meetup. I was paying them something like $25 a month. I had lots of people that joined on Meetup and never attended a meeting because they were nowhere near Northeast Ohio. And the problem with Meetup is when you go over a certain level, you have to pay more. And I was like, yeah, I'm not. And nobody was using it to like use it like a Facebook group, things like that. So I asked my audience, I'm like, hey, I'm not getting any value. Speaking of getting value from Meetup, I go, we get a couple people here and there, but in general, and if we moved, where would you want to move? And of course, they all said Facebook. And I was like, all right, well, we're moving to Facebook. I hope I don't get, I've been kicked out of my own Facebook group before spamming them and letting them know a meeting was coming up. So I get worried about that. But in terms of personal, I have found that I'm trying not to do anymore because it doesn't resonate with people, where we always have at the end open Q&A, but there were times like that was the title of the meeting, June 28th or whatever the next meeting is, open Q&A, and people aren't, I was hoping we're going to, well, that's always there. So I asked the audience, they're like, what about guest speakers? So like Kim Craggy, who's often in the Ask the Podcast Coach, she's a Toastmaster kind of guru, grand poobah. She's going to talk about storytelling next week. So I have found having topics might bring more people in. I might have Alex from Podmatch come on. We're going to try that. But the other thing is, I have found, at least I did this, we went virtual when COVID hit. And so when we went back to in person, there were people that started joining that were nowhere near Northeast Ohio. So we've kept it virtual, and we're about 50-50 at this point. We get people that come in person. The one thing I don't do that I wonder if I should, but we meet in a radio station, which is cool. But I often wonder sometimes if I had like pizza, if people would show up. I don't know. Have you done anything with, kind of podcaster meetups, or are there any out in your neck of the woods?
I've started a couple, and then they always I get a month or two in, and they kind of fall apart. I think the key for me is regular. You got to set a date and time.
Yeah.
Do a regular, even I've got a group of guys that I meet with that not podcaster related or whatever, but it's a very disparate group of guys. Like we're all over the place. We don't even work together anymore. We used to, and not all of them even worked together at the same time, which is guys we like getting together and join a cocktail or whatever. And so I set the last Wednesday, 4 p.m. every month. And you just got to you have to get it to the point where it's on people's calendars and they start thinking, oh yeah, no, I shouldn't schedule something on the last Wednesday of the month because that's the meetup time. The more regular you can be, I mean, like a small business, you got to survive. You have to have enough capital to survive the first year or you're not making any money. With a meetup group, you have to survive the first year until people get it on their calendar and you get it to be regular and you get some good content and people start looking forward to it. So you got to go like 6 months. I love your idea. People don't come to meet and greets for the most part. They might come to the first one. They won't come back for number 2. Yeah. Like we already did a meet and greet. What you said is, I think, so true. You have to have content. Yeah. It's like a podcast. If we did this podcast every week and we just took questions from the audience, it wouldn't work. I mean, that's a total lie. That's what we do. That's what you and I. It somehow works. You bring content to it though. So that's probably the magic in it. Is you always have stuff lined up, but you have to have some content.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. Scott says the one in Tampa, which I've been to every month, is great. Second Tuesday every month for years.
Yep.
The Northeast Ohio Podcasters is the last Monday of the month.
Yep.
So that always works. And then just have content. And the other thing to think about, because on one hand, you're like, oh, this is a great networking opportunity. And a lot of podcasters are introverts. And the fun thing is you'll also, and I'm not I don't want to get down again. I don't want to go down this thing, but we have a guy that streams live from his phone on Twitch. Okay, technically not a podcaster, but I don't care. I'm not dying on that hill, but that's always kind of fun. He says here, I'm not using Meetup. Yeah, you're not, luckily the library is going to do all the promotion, which covers 3 counties in Central Virginia. Good to hear we're doing. Yeah, that's really it. And then the other one, like Jim said, if I can remember, and this is where I just need to automate this, and you can in Facebook. The one thing I noticed, I have had a Facebook group for years, and along the way, they've added a ton of features that I was not paying attention to. Like I actually manually go in and say, let's welcome the new members of the School of Podcast. Yeah, you can automate that. There are a bunch of automation things that I did. But you need to let people know about a week before and then the day of, like the morning of, like, hey, don't forget tonight at 7, and then the other thing, man, we had a guy he was so upset that he didn't say a word and will probably never come back. And that is, we meet, it's a high school. Well, we have a weird thing in Akron where all of our schools now are community centers because we could get more tax money for that. So we rebuilt all our schools and they're now community centers. And there's a local radio station that's in the high school. So this guy drives 45 minutes from Cleveland, comes in and is just like, oh, couldn't find this place. Your directions aren't very good. And I'm like, oh man, I'm so sorry. So glad you're here. Like, come on over. We're at a table. You're sitting 15 feet from us over in these chairs. And he's like, nah, I'm good. Like, I'm just going to listen. Like, okay. So if you, for some reason, might have more than one door to different establishments in your building, you might want to add some.
It doesn't matter with him.
Yeah.
There's always those people, though.
I was like, wow.
Yeah.
DR says she finds, by the way, if you're in Nashville has a really good group. Atlanta with Mark Deal has a really good group. Dave's group in Northeast Ohio, fun people, but I think I've only hit double digits twice. It's always like 5 or 6. Now, if I count the people online, that's different. But in person, we have about 5 people, which is fine. We have a good time. But DR says, I find a lot of Nashville podcasters groups are hobby podcasters, so I'm a little out of place. Well, yeah, if you're there for trying to find people to, produce and that whole 9 yards. And that's the other reason why I quit using Meetup, because I was like, why did I start this? Same thing with a podcast, right? Why am I doing this? Who is it for? And what do they want? And I was like, well, I started this so I could say School of Podcasting in front of a bunch of new podcasters. And I've gotten maybe 2 clients from that. Again, it's not a huge group, but I was like, I went into my history and I saw how long I've been paying them $25 a month. And I was like, yeah, this is not a good return on investment. And then it was like, okay, do we cancel? Like, do I just quit and say, yeah, we're not doing this anymore? And so I was like, no, I am having fun.
Mm-hmm.
It's for me a social thing now. It's my little group, and we hang out. And a lot of times after the meeting, the conversations get deep, and they're nothing about podcasting. It's a bunch of friends hanging out. So that's kind of cool. So I was like, yeah, I just need to quit losing money on this. That's basically I've gone through. We've talked about this, different things. Like I just found. I am so, and I guess this is the wrong thing to say, but I'm going to say it. You ready for me to be politically incorrect, Jim?
Oh boy, here we go.
I am grandfathered in. That's ageist. Did you know that? I'm grandfathered in on Acuity scheduling, which is a great tool, by the way. I was paying $10 a month, and it dawned on me. I bought TidyCal like forever ago, and they kept adding more features, and I was like, oh. This does everything Acuity scheduling does, except for one thing. Acuity, I could set up an event and sell tickets for like 8 people. Like it could stop at 8. And I was like, ooh, that's a cool feature that in 18 years I've never used. And I was like, it's only $10. And I was, yeah, it's also $120 a year. So I now changed all my links to TidyCal, which is what you call it. Yeah, TDR says I just switched over to. Yeah, it's a one-time payment. I probably have a link here somewhere. But it does everything that Calendly does, and it's one of those lovely AppSumo things. And like I said, they keep adding more features to it. And the Calendly, or I'm sorry, the Acuity scheduling, their page was okay, like a landing page. You can make your own landing page. That's the other thing. So I forget what got me on the subject of this. Oh, saving money with Meetup. And so far, we're actually getting a little more because we had, well, 0 interaction in the Meetup group. And that's because I never put anything over there. So hopefully we'll get a little more interaction. We'll have some discussion of that. And yeah, Chris Stone says Mark Deal runs a great podcast Atlanta Meetup. Yeah, that's the one I would like to go to. I've driven to Nashville. I spoke once at podcast or at the Nashville Meetup once. Dave Hooper and I forget the other guy's name with glasses. But it's a great group. Uncle Marv says, just heard the end of the comments on content. Just posted show 500 this week. Well, holy cow, that's fun. Didn't think it would be celebrated, that much, but and as soon as I clicked on that, got the long emails thanking me for show and content. Yeah, 500, man. We're at 440. I was like, ooh, pretty soon we're gonna have 444, which is the magic number of I have no idea. But
just wait till we get to 666.
Oh, that'll be
Are we
fun.
gonna get to 666? Do you think?
Let's see.
We should plan to quit right at 666.
That's it. Yeah,
665.
Yeah. There you go. Coach Dave says, I used TidyCal for a long time. Challenge with two-way sync. Then they sync from Tidy to Outlook, no problem. The opposite way. See, I don't use Outlook. I use Google Calendar, but that's good to know. Yes, Mr. Buckner's the other guy in Nashville. So, and now Coach Dave says he's using HubSpot until TidyCal can get that sync issue fixed. They're working on it. Well, that's good. Yeah, they do. It's actively being developed, and it's just one of those. They have TidyCal, and they have another email client that's something. SendFox is their email list management. And they give you a one-time thing, but then it's $10 a month, which again is nothing compared to something like MailChimp or something like that. That will basically make sure your email's delivered. I forget what they call it, but there you go. Spoon says 444 is a tuning for, actually it's 440, but close enough. Yeah. SendFox. Yep. They're all going in. So yeah, so that would be my guess. Then the other thing is, now, what do I always say about podcasting? I'm like, ask your audience. So I asked the people there, and they're like, why don't we get some outside speakers? And I was like, that sounds good, because all I have to do is go find some outside speakers, which isn't that hard, and say, hey, how'd you like to show up virtually on 7 p.m. on the last Monday of the month? So we'll see how that happens, because right now the group isn't really growing much. We get the occasional new people in, but and then the other thing is, again, promoting it. So like I should, being that we're now almost halfway through the month, I should start saying, hey, be sure to invite a friend. We've got a special speaker this week or this month, that whole 9 yards. So keep that in mind. And speaking of trying new things, another fun-filled question here said, I want to change my podcast theme. I feel restricted with my current podcast theme. I would like to add more topics to explore on the show, but my branding is working against me. A year ago, I started yet another entrepreneurship podcast as I was building my first business as an excuse to meet and learn from entrepreneurs in my city. At 25 plus interviews now with over 40 episodes, not super popular by any means. I would love to know what I get less than 150 downloads per episode. Let's say it was 100. That is 5 classrooms of people. Come on now. The podcast is called My First Business, which I think is a great name. But I've been a lifelong student of how to live an interesting life, of which business was just one part. Lately, I've been itching to make content about things other than business. Think Tim Ferriss, but not that intense. So his question is it awkward to feature non-business content on a podcast called My First Business? And I was like, here again, the favorite answer is it depends. But if he had a lawyer on to talk about the legal aspects of starting your first, it's still about my first business. I don't know if he starts, like, hey, welcome to my first business. Today we're going to be talking about meditation. I'll be like, we get into like false advertising. I don't know. And then a couple other things he asked here. Any risk of rebranding it to my personal name instead? My first business, people know what it's about. I have no idea what this guy's name was. So let's say it's Craig Van Helsing. Okay, Craig, don't know who you are. That's not really, unless you're a known name. Should I leave the old episodes as is and just post new content within the same channels? Yeah, I would. If you're going to rebrand, make an episode called We Are Changing the Name, where you go, hey, welcome to, my first business. Just so you know, on Monday, we're changing the name to the Craig Van Helsing Show, where we talk about whatever I want to. And you're going to have a lot of people leave, for the record. But keep that in mind. And then he gets into, does Spotify allow for name changes while holding everything else constant? Yeah, it's all you have to do is change your name and artwork in your whoever your media host is, and then the apps. Just think of the apps: Apple, Google, Spotify, Amazon, etc. They're just mirrors that reflect whatever is in your media host. So, Jim, thoughts?
Yeah, I think in this case, let the title be your friend. I've listened to a couple different podcasts that have alternating content on a weekly basis. So, One Nation Under Whiskey, they release one that's the title of the podcast, and then they have one called Extra Extra, and it's, instead of being 2 hours, it's 35 minutes, and it's based on a news story. So different kind of content, but same feed, right? And so they just let the titles, so that way I know, hey, am I listening to which podcast am I listening to? Cigar Authority does the same thing. They have an after show that they also put. So they do a 2 hour. There's a trend here: 2 hour podcast and a 30-minute after show, and they put them in the same feed. I find them very successful. The longer show gets more downloads than the shorter one does, which is crazy on that, right? It's just you think people want short content, but when they engage with you, they want as much as you can give them. So that's one of those counterintuitive, I think, piece of advice for a lot of podcasters. It's like they can always listen to less, but they can't make up more. They can't add more of your content. Once it's been listened to and it's done, it's done. So make it as long as you want it to. They'll turn you off if they don't like it.
Well, is the whiskey show, like on these different types of show, the extra, is it still talking about whiskey?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
But different, it's still a little different content. The subject is the same. But in this case, with this business person who's bringing in, I imagine if you, like, I had Dan Lefebvre on the podcast. The first time I had him on Home Gadget Geeks, we talked about his shows that related to technology. It was a stretch. It was like, you kind of like, oh, I don't know. I got feedback from one of my listeners who said, when you started the show, I wasn't sure how you were going to tie the two together, and I didn't think you were going to keep me interested in movies that long, but you did, right? So you can be creative about it with your audience. You do this all the time, Dave. You stretch things, like you're like, hey, I'm going to bring this back to podcasting somehow, right? And we kind of stretch it a little bit. So if you're a business podcast and you're going to talk about growing flowers, well, maybe to bring in the business of growing flowers, talk a little bit, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah, my Todd the Gator really liked my last episode of the School of Podcasting. If you go to schoolofpodcasting.com/882, I believe. And I started off the show with Robo Dave, where I went to 11 labs and uploaded 4 1-minute clips, and it spit out a thing that sounded a lot like me, which was kind of spooky. And then in London, somebody used Telegraph, some app, and had Joe Rogan do a shout out for me, and it sounded a lot like Joe Rogan. That was really spooky. And so the whole thing was about, hey, if let's go with robots are going to take over podcasting, what can we do that they don't? And that's, they don't have the experiences that we do. So embrace your humanness, but kind of now bringing this back to me, bringing things back. In there,
A bring back Inception.
yes, it is. I talked about how I watched the movie 8 Days a Week on Hulu. It's a Beatles documentary by Ron Howard, and there were a bunch of things in there like the early Beatles. They knew what their audience wanted, right? These girls were screaming for no apparent reason, so all of their songs are about "I love you," "Girl meets boy," and they were all singular. It wasn't like, "Hey, everybody, I want to shake your hands." Nope, it was, "I want to shake your hand." If I fell in love with you, it was all singular stuff. And then later they dropped enough acid to kill a horse, and their songs expanded. But so that was an example of I'm still talking about podcasting, but it was through the lens of the Beatles and the fact that it's this whole thing with AI is getting, on one hand it's spooky, it's also like, wow, that's cool. Like I sent Robo Dave to my brother, and in the middle of it I go, oh, by the way, this isn't Dave. And he's like, what is this voodoo you are sending me, man? It's like, that's so weird. So thanks for that, Todd. But going back to shows here and changing your brand, Brad says, when I go to new shows, I'm amazed at the number with titles like The Bob Smith Show, Chat with Susie. Yeah, I in the school of podcasting, I don't want to throw this person under the bus, but there was somebody at Libsyn that literally had the name of the show, episode spelled out 1, season spelled out, or season 1, episode 12, and then the name of the person. That was it. Nothing like, what am I going to gain from listening to Jim Cullison? What's the takeaway? Nope. Just the episode and the season. And I just took a screenshot and I said, don't do this. That was it. That was a comment on it. So yeah, I like the idea of what Jim's talking about. If you really want to talk about something that's not related at all to my first business, everybody does it. All the cool kids are doing it. Start a second podcast. That's another option. Because that's
just do it. Like, let your audience know, hey, this week I just want to do this. And
right.
So if you want to, I'm warning you up front, this may be a little different, and here's what we're going to talk about. Stay around if you want. Otherwise, we'll see you next week. I'll be back because Dave, you may not have enough content to start a whole nother
podcast. That's true. Yeah. I've done that. I've had a couple where I've talked about the mental aspects of podcasting and how to avoid burnout.
Yeah.
And I always kind of say, look, we're not talking about microphones and downloads today, but it is important.
Well, you came on my show and we talked about microphones and downloads. And it's a gadget show, but this was pre-pandemic, and I kind of turned on the audience and say, hey, look, we're all dealing with communication from a computer standpoint. We weren't doing as much of this then as we were now, but it was good to talk about equipment. Those are gadgets. All this stuff is gadgets. It works right now. It may not be the traditional gadgetry that we think, but I had a great conversation with you and we enjoyed it. And I thought it was good. And the audience, liked it. And so I think you can get kind of creative.
Yeah. Well, again, it's your show. You can do with it whatever you want. Dan says, my last episode was different than usual, but it was something I wanted to do. So I started by saying the episode is going to be different. Yep. And again, nobody's going to punch you in the face. You could always try it as a segment, Sean says, near the end of the podcast where all the super listeners are, right? And if you get enough feedback, do it a little more. Yeah, that's true. That's right. Bernie ran out of things to say, Coach Dave says. Well, because he died. That was the problem. You might.
That's way too soon. That is way too soon.
Speaking of gadgets, though, somebody asked, and I didn't even know this existed, Mackie Mcaster Studio versus Rodecaster Duo, which, by the way, the shipping of that has been delayed. Now they're saying July. Are these even the same league? No, they're not. The Mackie Mcaster is meant for live streaming. There's no recorder in it. So you know how Rodecaster has the OnlyFans version? It's just streaming with a video thing. And yeah, that's kind of what the Mcaster is. Same thing. You can have little sound effects and that kind of stuff. And I think they have a thing where you can change your voice, but it's only one mic. It's really meant for live streamers that are probably gamers, things like that. It's $300. The Rodecaster Duo is $500. He says, I record my podcast using Riverside with my partners and guests. I have a Shure MV7, and I like finer grain control over vocal effects. Ooh, vocal. Well, I don't have any set up right now, but the Rode Duo would have the whole make your, Satan and then the elf and that whole 9 yards. So, which is always weird. That can get a little old after a while. I know. I think if I turned them on, Jim would start rolling his eyes like, "Oh, Dave found the elf button again." So we'll see. I had, where's my starred stuff here?
Here, let me Dan said in chat,
Yeah.
he said, my last episode was different than usual, but was something I wanted to do. So I started just by saying the episode will be a little bit different, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a great way of doing it. And then Sean says, Sean says you could try it as a segment near the end of, I like this idea, near the end of the podcast. If you get enough feedback, if you get enough feedback, do it a little more. I love that idea of throwing it in at the end, and then see what the audience says. If they ask for, like, I'd really like more of that, then you're like, okay, we can expand that segment out.
Yeah. Speaking of new shows, DR is, I'm prepping my own podcast and had something like Podcasting for Entrepreneurs. I DM Gordon Firemark, and he said the Entrepreneur magazine will come after me. Yeah. John Lee Dumas, whose dad is a lawyer, could have easily, had free legal people, but there's a big old team of people at Entrepreneur. That's what, if you ever wonder why John talks, he will say, I think he has to say Entrepreneurs on Fire. And he usually says EO Fire, because it was just one of those where it was like, oh, this is going to even if you had free legal from his dad, that was going to get dragged on a lot. And so I would not now podcasting for entrepreneurs. That's you could always, that's a tough one. Yeah, maybe, it's I don't know if you reach out to them ahead of time and say, hey, I'm thinking of doing a podcast called Podcast for Entrepreneurs. Are you going to get any people to email you back from Entrepreneur, the magazine? I don't know, but it's true. They've gone after, they went after JLD, and he was eventually like, okay, enough of that. I'm just going to change the name. So I don't know. Be fun. But I remember when that happened, I was like, wow. And that's when you're like, wow, how do you know if you're going to get sued is when you start making money at it, and when you start outranking somebody for their keyword, that's when they're going to like, okay, release the hounds. So that would be it. But speaking of releasing the hounds, I'd like to release some thanks to the awesome people. And what's going to be fun about this is I forgot to update the thing. So we're going to do, I'm letting everyone know, we're going to do something a little different this time. Because normally, well, first of all, if you want to start a podcast, I would love to help you. You've got courses, you got coaching and community and unlimited, that's not a typo, one-on-one coaching at the School of Podcasting.com. But yes, actually, you know what? We'll leave that in there. I mentioned it earlier. The Spotlight Supporter of the Week is those lovely ladies over at Keep the Flame Alive. Go to flamealivepod.com, website by Mark at podcastbranding.co. But the other thing, and I'll do this anyway, if you would like your name on this website, you could be here. And that is the lovely, awesome supporters over there. So you can see there's the $20 supporters. If you support us with $10, like Sean and Kyle and Dr. Norm and Jen and Michael, your name could be over there. And notice there is a link to your podcast over there as well. So you do get a link, and it's only $10 a month. I think there's even a $5 one, but that's just a way to say thanks. And I'm trying to find the stop button. There we go. But I wasn't done with this. So Ask the Podcast Coach runs on Podpage. If you'd like to try Podpage, go over to trypodpage.com. And if you need more Jim Cullison, and who doesn't, theaverageguy.tv is where you can find Jim and Home Gadget Geeks. And again, we're on our journey to 100. And this week we added 0. We have no more new. And again, remember that when you sign up your first shout out is going to be huge, and we'll play sound effects and David Lee Roth and really point people at your website. There we go. And yes, somebody's mentioning Kyle Bondo, Merchants of Dirt. I love the name of that show. What are you? I'm a merchant of dirt. So there we go. So thank you for everyone who is an awesome supporter. Go over to askthepodcastcoach.com/awesome and be an awesome supporter today. And DR's got another point here. She says, I changed it. Okay, so she changed the entrepreneur thing. I went to ChatGPT and asked for 10 good titles without entrepreneur in it. Yeah. And also keep the word podcast out of it. Now, in your case, you're saying podcasting for whatever, small business people, something like that. That's different. But I like when it's the whatever, Janet Smith podcast, which is weird because then it would just be Janet Smith, which is maybe a red flag that maybe you shouldn't name the name of your show your name unless people know who you are. So if it's, the John Stamos show, okay. But even again, I'd call it a show, not a podcast, because when you put the word podcast and the word you rank against every show. And I need to check. I think Daniel said this is not as accurate as it used to be. Like it doesn't mess up you in search. I'll have to go back and listen to that episode, but titles are tricky and you can always change them later if you need to. So keep that in mind. So here is, we already did that one.
Well, hold on before you move on. If you do have your name in the show name in iTunes and all the other podcast players, I think you're doubling up your name both in the title and in the author. And I think Google's smart enough to know using that author tag that it associates your name with the podcast. And so you're wasting space. I mean, you're wasting valuable keyword space. So I don't know. Dave, there's times when putting your name in there is appropriate, but
put it in the author field. But
for sure. But I mean, even in the title, there might be some times where your name is appropriate, but your mileage might vary. It is doubling it up a little bit.
Yeah, when it's meditation for small business with Katie Kremitzos.
Yeah.
I've seen that kind of stuff. So here was a fun one that I saw, and it's about your RSS feed. How to download the RSS XML for linking on my own personal website. Does anyone know how to download the XML file from an RSS host? I'm using rss.com. Well, for the record, to answer that question, put your RSS feed into Chrome, select all, copy, paste in a notepad, you've got it. But you don't want to do that. I noticed that many of the major podcasters rehost the file on their personal websites, even if they use hosts like Blueberry, RSS, or Libsyn.com. So for like example.com/feed/podcast, that many times it's actually PowerPress. And so it's not that they're rehosting it, it's that they're using the RSS feed on their website. He goes, I think it's a good idea to make subscribing easier. It doesn't make subscribing any easier, but can't figure out how to download and properly host this file in a directory on my own website. So there are a couple of things that and that's it. It doesn't make it easier because it's on your website. An RSS feed, if it was, dave.libsyn.com/RSS, isn't going to be any easier to subscribe than, dave.com/feed/RSS. It's the same thing. What you want to do is get the links to Apple, Google, Spotify, and Amazon, and you can get those links simply by going to your show and searching for it. In almost all of them, they have some sort of share button, and it'll give you the link, and you can copy that. But the thing I always point out from my own personal experience was in the early days of podcasting, I was using PowerPress, which, by the way, phenomenal plugin. They're adding podcasting 2.0 features to it, but your RSS feed is on your website. And I all of a sudden got super duper popular. And so if you have, let's say, Apple Podcasts set up to check your feed once an hour, and then you get 3,000 people checking your feed once an hour, even though the RSS feed or your actual, that document is just a text file, but the more episodes you get, the bigger it's going to be. And so that's why Blueberry even has podcastmirror.com. So in the event that you're getting like, hey, I'm almost taking down my website because of all this bandwidth, because I've got popular, you can throw it on podcastmirror.com. But the thing was like, I make it easier to subscribe. I was like, nope, not really. And then the other thing to keep in mind, anytime you say, I want to do this to my feed, my sphincter gets just a little like, I'm a little tighter on that, because you've gone from outpatient surgery. We're talking about rebranding, right? Okay, change the name, change the artwork, no big deal, no harm, no foul if you have a typo. You mess up your feed, at times you can lose your audience. So I don't know. Have you ever messed with your feed, Jim, or anything? Any play?
No, Lord, no.
Yeah.
Like there's other things to mess up, but do not go in there and change the feed. I mean, I've changed the name of the show. In fact, the feed I think still has the old show name in it in some cases or whatever. But no, I think the URL's got some stuff in it, but I try not to. It's just too complicated.
Well, the other thing I always, because on occasion I'll get somebody ellipse and they're obsessing again, overthinking things, and I always ask them like, Jim, what's one of your favorite podcasts?
Are you asking me?
Yeah,
this one.
Okay, but
we'll say Windows Weekly.
Windows Weekly, great. What's their feed?
No idea.
Exactly, and that's where I'm like, no, feeds are not meant for people; they're meant for apps. And again, I think sometimes I don't know why we get distracted, but this is something that I'm like, yeah, you're worrying about something you don't need to worry about. It's already set up. Apps are reading it. As long as it's valid, you're good to go. And yeah, I was just like, that's a weird one. So keep that in mind. Here's again, I saw these, like, these are different. Changing a person's voice while keeping it sounding natural while being interviewed is something they're trying to do. Due to the topic and their experiences, they are very concerned that their voices will be recognized. I'm trying to find a way to do this live to alter their voice and yet not make it sound robotic or weird. Does anyone have any plugins or methods that will work? Just changing the pitch didn't work. Ideally, it would change as we're recording so I don't have issues when, for example, we, the hosts, and they overlap. And that's I was like, well, there's a question I haven't answered a lot. The thing you have to keep in mind, and this is one of those where I say, when people talk about they're going to steal my content, and I'm like, if I can hear it, if I can see it, I can steal it. And the person that, steals tutorials from the School of Podcasting, nothing I can do about that. Welcome to the internet. And so if somebody really wants to figure out who that is, if you go in and you change their voice 7 whatever tones down, and so instead of talking like this, they now sound like this. All somebody has to do is take that same tool and go, hey, put it up 7 tunes, and all of a sudden they will sound like this. So that's not really a way to keep them super safe. And people are talking about this on Reddit. I think the only way, if you really wanted somebody to not be discovered, would be to record it normal, take their part, have it transcribed, and have somebody else read it, which sounds like a whole lot of hassle in my book. But and then it's got to be somebody else. That's you, because anything you do in post-production can be undone in post-production, I would think. Am I missing anything?
Yeah, I think you're right on. It's a difficult problem. There may be some way through AI here in the future where there's going to be a delay, right? There's going to be a delay, but where it's listening, and then you could have AI read it. You could have an AI voice read it, right? So you could have any voice.
Yeah, it's true. 11 Labs. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would work. And that's going to sound just as robotic, which isn't very these days.
It's pretty good.
As if you took something and made them sound like this. So yeah, it's that's the part that's really spooky about 11 Labs is you can go over and say, give me a 30-year-old male with a Southern accent. And next thing you know, howdy, you're like, okay, that's weird. So, but that was one I was like, that's a question that's out there a bit. This one I see a lot. And I'm like, I want to start a podcast. I have a really great idea and a key demographic in mind. However, I'm so scared. I'm so scared to promote it. I'm scared of what people would think. and how it would potentially affect my kids, which makes me wonder what the topic is. I'm also scared that no one would care. I don't want to dump a bunch of money into something and have it not work out. Anyone have any tips or things I could do to get over my fear? So they have a key demographic. I'm scared of what people would think. So to that I go, well, guess what? Have you gone to Walmart in the past 6 months? And they'll go, yeah. And I go, guess what? The person standing behind you in line was looking at what's in your cart. They're looking at what you're wearing, and they're judging you plus or minus. I'm like, it's just something people do. Do you care what people did? That stop you from going to Walmart? I don't know. What would you say to people that are like,
in some cases it would, I think, for people. Well, it's fear. Like this is the fear of being judged, or the fear of failure, or the fear. I mean, and it's a real thing. I think sometimes we think, and you and I were talking about this in the pre-show a little bit. I think sometimes our advice is like, well, you got to get past it. But I think we need to give people real strategies for actually getting past it. We've done this in the past. Let me give you an example. So sometimes when I get that fear of doing that, I have to trick myself into just actually getting it done. So sometimes we overthink things, and we think about it, and we think about it, and we think about it, and then we don't do it. I'll just start doing one thing that will lead to the next thing. And I try to I almost try to fool myself into getting, to just getting started. And then once I get started, you kind of start realizing, okay, this isn't as bad as I thought it was. But I think you need to come up based on who you are and what you've been successful with in the past. And then start thinking, okay, how can I use who I am to get this done and get past the parts that are of fear? Because they're real, right? I mean, we're all afraid of things. We're all afraid to do things. We all struggle with that kind of stuff. And I think individually, we just got to look at it and say, I got to find out some successful strategies to get past this. Another one might be do it with someone else who has done it before.
right?
Partner with someone. You don't have to be alone on this thing. Do it. I ran a lot of miles in my 40s. I ran 5 marathons and probably 100 half marathons. I never did them alone. Never. I always did them with somebody else, because running alone is boring. Like, now, listen, I know there's people who do it and you're really great at it, and it's your time to be alone, and it's fantastic, and blah, blah, blah. For me, I'm not out there unless I'm, I've got somebody doing it with me. I am a social runner is kind of what I said. So, Dave, I think there could be some strategies thinking through that to say, yeah, how do I use who I am to get past it? And I've really got to do some things. I can't let it defeat me. I've got to find ways to get past it.
That's it. I was listening to a book on dieting and losing weight, and they said some people will say, I can't give up Coke, or that sounds like cocaine. Anyway, I can't give up McDonald's.
Yeah.
And the person that loses weight is like, okay, how can I figure out a way? Like, you have to think it's possible. And the only thing that kind of jumped out at me, I'm scared of what people would think and how it would potentially affect my kids. If you're talking about how, let's say this is a mom. I don't know if it's a male, or let's say it's a mom.
Yeah.
And you're talking about how you had sex with the entire high school football team. That might affect your kids a little bit. So keep in mind, or if you talk about your kids, if you're like, well, welcome to, the Busy Mom podcast, and man, my kids are driving me nuts. Maybe not something. You got to be careful when you talk about your family in a podcast. I learned that the hard way. Be very, very careful with that. I'm also scared that nobody would care. I get that, which is probably the biggest reason why they're not promoting that whole, like, it's better to be, how's that go? It's better to think you have, if you're a singer, it's best to have people think that you have an endless range than to sing outside of it and remove all doubt. There's something. Yeah. So it's the whole, like, if I put this out there, I think nobody's going to listen to this, but if I put this out, nobody listens to it. Now I've convinced myself that I'm worthless, and that's a horrible thing to feel. So that goes back to, where's my good friend? Especially when you're starting out, You don't want. Oh, I don't know where Glenn ran away to. Doggone it, Glenn, where are you at? Come here, buddy. Well, we have David Lee Roth. I lost my Glenn. Oh, here. No. Yes, maybe. You know what? The time is gone. Glenn would say, "Don't be boring." And I thought I had.
Hold on, I'll do it. Don't be boring. Right?
That was pretty good.
Yeah.
And I know you're really just trying to do Kermit the Frog, but in the process,
it's the same person. I'm pretty sure.
Oh my goodness. And then I don't want to dump a bunch of money into something. Well, a bunch of money is defined by many different people. Maybe that could be a contest. Imitate Glenn the Geek.
We've heard that quote so many times.
Yeah.
Don't be boring.
Yeah. And I could have sworn I had it here somewhere, but I don't. Anyway, but speaking of this, we do have this one.
No one will punch you in the face.
There we go. But in terms of dumping a bunch of money into it, if you're doing a solo show, I'm not making this up. You can start a podcast for under $100. Samson Q2U done. Maybe $5 on a windscreen. But yeah, it is hard to say just start when you're scared, but there's only way. I mean, I'm afraid of heights, and I got up in a hot air balloon because I saw a 3-year-old get on a hot air balloon and wasn't scared at all. And I was like, all right, if that kid can do it, I can do it, and I didn't die. So it's hard facing your fears, but the thing to keep in mind, if nobody likes it, they won't listen. Somebody's going to like it because there are bazillions of people in there. Now, are you going to be famous and, that whole nine? Probably not. And most people are not, but that's where you got to answer, why am I doing this? Who's it's for? And what do they want? And then how am I going to measure my success? That's really it. But we did have kind of in a similar vein. How do I get inspiration? I've always been a podcast enthusiast, and I've been listening to podcasts covering all sorts of topics for many years. During the first lockdown, I started my own podcast covering a very interesting topic for me, environmental politics, which I eventually stopped because of university and work. Now, as I finish university and I have a typical 9 to 5, I want to start another podcast to do something creative after work, to which I kind of want to go, why not environmental politics? But okay. However, I can't seem to find a topic that that's worth investing my time in. I'm not aiming to become extra famous or rich with my podcast, but I'd still like to talk about something I'm interested in that can be appreciated. How do I find a topic? I already made a list of things I like, and I made market research, but I don't seem to have the eureka moment. What would you suggest? And so part of me goes, if you can't figure out what to talk about, don't start a podcast. Am I allowed to say that? Mm-hmm. The other thing is, see, he's already done a podcast. If you're brand new, we were talking before we started, there's a website called Storyworth that I actually ordered because I do a show where I talk about me called Building a Better Dave. And it was like $80 and what they do is they send you can pick a bunch of questions, and then they will send them to you, and you basically type out your answer. And then if you want, they will make a book out of them. And I was like, oh, that sounds neat. I wonder what the questions are. So I wanted to see the questions because those might be good for that show. So if you hadn't been podcasting before and wanted to just get in the habit of talking into a microphone and things like that, we all have grandparents. That was one of the questions was, tell me about your grandparents. And I was like, oh, okay, but it could be like, what's your favorite childhood memory? If you just need something to talk about, pick anything and just talk into the microphone just to get used to, the equipment and recording and things like that. But if you can't, I always say, whatever you pick for your topic, no matter whether you want to monetize or not, you are going to talk about it for free for a considerable amount of time. And so if that's more than 9 episodes, and that's another good thing, right? Always write down 20 topics that you would want to talk about. That's kind of a way to filter out, am I going to talk about this or not? I don't know what. I'm sure you run into people that I want to start a podcast about what? I don't know.
Yeah. Besides the fear of having a topic and they can never get, to the launch point. I think if you're searching for a topic, do a bunch of Zoom calls or whatever you want to use with groups of people that and talk about some things. See if anything sticks or lands with people. I don't know why people think they have to actually do the podcast for it to be a podcast. If you just want to talk, you can just schedule time with people. Like, find some people who are interested in the topic. Say like, hey, I want to talk about I played disc golf this morning, so I want to talk about disc golf. Put that out to your communities and say, I want to do a call, see who shows up, have a conversation about disc golf, see if you're any good with it. See if it's interesting. See if it goes beyond a single call. See if you know enough to take it beyond a single call, right? Type deal. Test it out first. I think some people think once they say it once, they can't ever say the same thing again. I mean, Dave, you and I at 440, I mean, we repeat this we say the same thing all the time, right? Just because you said it once in the original. So just because you do some test pilot practice, whatever, doesn't mean you can't come back around and do that again, or take the content you recorded in these conversations and make it a mega episode. I mean, there's lots of creative things you can do. You don't have to do a podcast the very first thing. There's tons of things you can do to lead up to the podcast. If it catches on, if people get interested, this is the number one sign you should start a podcast. Somebody goes, you should start a podcast about that. Right? Number one sign. Then right? So those are my thoughts.
My oldest friend, I've known him since I was 12, was in town this week, and we went out a couple times out to dinner and things like that. And this is a weird idea, and Jim just mentioned this, and I was like, you can actually do that. We had conversations and didn't record any of them.
Right.
You can actually you don't have, everything doesn't have to be, I know.
Are you conversations that aren't recorded?
Yeah. We talked about old 80s guitar players and bands, all sorts of crazy stuff. We talked about, wives and kids and,
How dare you have conversations without recording it?
Because somebody asked me once, they said, what is the difference between a conversation and a podcast? Because you want your podcast to be conversational. I go, a podcast is a conversation where the boring stuff has been removed. I go, that's in my opinion. It's kind of, if it's an interview thing.
Yeah. I knew an NPR guy that put a lapel on and a recorder in his pocket, and for months recorded his whole day, and was wanted to make, I don't know where it went, but was kind of make something out of that. Could you imagine you're trying to edit your whole day? Would you edit you editing your whole day? Like, does that all of a sudden become an edit inception when you're doing something like that?
There's a podcast they did for Chris Kermitsos called The Messengers. It was very meta. It was a podcast about a documentary about podcasting, and he would just dump hours of conversations, many of them him playing with his kid. I'm like, you could have hit the stop button on that. And so, but that was one where it was cool, but I had to listen to a lot of stuff. There's a podcast coming out Tuesday called Ladybird, and they went through archives, like hundreds of hours of Lady Bird Johnson, who was the first lady to Lyndon B. And I guess it's really interesting, all sorts of behind the scenes stuff. But she had to wade through, like, it took her a year and a half to make this podcast. She's there's a Texas school that has a podcasting part of their curriculum. And so they're using Libsyn, and I was kind of coaching them through how to set things up, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, man, that's going to be a really cool podcast. But it's weird because she talks about how she met, LBJ, and, kind of her first impressions, and the fact that he asked her to marry him, like, after their first meeting, stuff like that. That's kind of interesting. But, and she said it's interesting because she's really going to promote it. She's in Texas, and apparently everything in Texas is named Johnson at the end of it because they were just huge at the time. So that'll be fun, but that's one where, those were recorded, never thinking they were going to be a podcast. So there was a lot of editing to find the good stuff and cut out the boring stuff. So
there's also an interesting technique to that a pastor that I used to listen to a church podcast. Well, this was even before podcast. Remember when they used to send out messages on tape?
oh yeah,
Remember that? You get them on tape. Those are actually podcasts, but
yeah.
they just didn't have an RSS feed.
Sissy.
So Chuck Swindoll would preach, and then he would take a 12 sermon series and condense it down into shorter versions of each one of those. Then he'd take that and combine it into one thing that was even smaller, and then take those smaller things and combine them together into another series, into a book. Like, he was the best guy I've ever seen of taking long form content and reusing it over and over and over again. I think some people think, say you have a year of podcasts and they think on the first run, they've got to condense those down into one thing.
Right.
Well, no. How about we start with take the best of the month, and then maybe take that month and, okay, of that you have for the months, take that. How can I get the best of the quarters, right? Condense it down again, releasing it each time so people can listen to it again, right? It's a summary. It's good stuff. And then maybe on a yearly basis, and then maybe you take your every 5 years, you put all that stuff together. So don't feel like you gotta take a gigantic thing and condense it down into one. Condense it down each time, and then just keep working your way down. Yeah, I guess that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, again, you can make things way much bigger and complicated and keep it simple.
Yeah, well, you can reuse content. And this is a good way to reuse content. And in the process of reusing the content, you're condensing it down. It's a lot less daunting of a task if you do it in little chunks, bring it together logically, than to try to take a whole year's worth of content and condense it down to an hour at the end of the year.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of these best of shows that people used to make. That's really, really daunting. What if you did the best of the month, and then you could say the best of the quarter? And by the way, when you get to the end of the year, your job's done for you. Pick whatever was best of the quarters, put that in your year-end review, and you'd be done.
There you go. Robert Lewis. Oh, The Happy Diabetic, I believe, if I remember right, is his show, or The Happy Diabetic Chef. I know he's a chef. Says, I'm rebuilding my website. Recommended way to show off the podcast, perhaps a separate tab. This is where it's tricky. You always have to ask yourself, and I switched the school of podcasting about a year or two ago. Is this a podcast that has a business, or a business that has a podcast? Because for the longest time, it was a podcast that had a business. And I was like, it might get more listeners if I promoted the business. Here's what you can get from joining the School of Podcasting. Oh, by the way, you can listen to the episodes over there. So I have a tab that just says episodes. And then I definitely have schoolofpodcasting.com/subscribe, where I can send people to subscribe. But make it always treat every episode like a blog post. I see a lot of people that love to do that. Libsyn, Captivate, they all have like a set it and forget it player where you'll go over, you grab a code, and you'll put it on one page, and there are all your episodes. You get zero, and I mean zero SEO from that. It's great. You could have a page called Binge and let people binge, but I always say treat every episode. You've already got your episode description. Copy and paste that into your blog. Copy and paste the code for the player, presto, and then I have links to Apple, Google, Spotify, and Amazon there. And then, put it on a link. If you're using WordPress, you can make a category and call it, show or podcast or whatever. And then it's really easy to just make a link that will filter out everything that's not a podcast on that. And then again, you can make that a tab, things like that. But definitely get I actually, for some of my shows, what I put in my media host is a paragraph, maybe two, maybe some timestamps and links. When that gets to my website, I expand on that because now I'm in the land of Google and I want more good words, not just a word salad or word vomit. So that's something to keep in mind here. So let's see. Anne has a question. did you ever listen to Speaking of Teens for me? I did. I need to finish. I will finish that today. What I didn't do, and your show is very good, by the way. And did good. I'm going to answer this now because I need tone of voice for this. And Jim, you can tell me if I'm, just do one of these if I'm, because I'm going to say something that might be controversial. But Anne has a very, and I say this to point out that men are idiots. Okay. So I don't want to look like an idiot. I'm not agreeing with these people. But Anne is from the South. And so she has this ever so lovely, that's not how she sounds at all, but it's a Southern accent. We know what it sounds like. If I'm a comedian and I want to sound smart, am I going to use a British accent or a Southern accent?
It depends on your audience, but most Americans respect that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The British
so, and Anne's, Speaking of Teens is a show that I was like, she was talking about stuff that they should be talking about on the news, and they're not. I listened to a thing on TikTok, and I was like, oh. And so as I was listening to it, because this is one of those where it's my first impression. So I'm going through, and I hadn't seen her website yet, right? I'm going from the aspect of I found it in an app, and I'm listening to this, and I was like, ooh, that better be, because she was saying stuff, and I was like, oh, holy cow. So I said, number one, and this is what I mean by this, that she needs to have really extensive show notes, because there are idiot men that are going to go, it's just some Southern belle that's bored, and she doesn't know what she's talking about. And the beautiful thing is, when I got done and I went to her website, have I shot myself in the foot yet, Jim? I'm just pointing out that
I think you're okay.
Okay, because I'm like, I'm not agreeing with these people, and I'm just saying
yes.
that women get the short of the stick a lot of times.
They
and
do.
So what was beautiful about this is I went to her website, and everything she talked about, she had a link to. Because there were some things about TikTok that I was like, I knew there's the Dallas project where they're gonna, the idea was we'll keep the information in America, and that way it'll never get to China. Okay, maybe not, and so it was really cool. But yes, I need to send that over to you, because I did the audio version of it, and I said I would check out your website, and then I went to London, and I will finish that today. So thanks for the polite nudge. We have people commenting on me on the thing here. And that's the other thing. Anne's an attorney. You didn't mention that at the beginning of your show. You need to say, because it'll show your commitment. I'm a mom of, whatever, how many kids you got, former attorney, now teen advocate, because I had a business coach once that I had been inducted into the Podcasters Hall of Fame. He goes, why aren't you mentioning that? I'm like, it sounds kind of douchey. Like, look at me. And he's like, dude, how many people can say that? And I'm like, I don't know, 12, 15 maybe. He's like, would you please mention that at the beginning of your show? I'm like, okay. Mm-hmm. So it's anything you can do. Yeah, Michael Ray says it's authority. So keep that going. And then we have a bunch of starred things. We did that. Oh, and when we were doing the conversations, me and my friend, at the end of the meal, we asked the waiter if he could rate and review us.
Hey, this was a great conversation. Would you give me a 5-star?
5-star rating? Yeah.
Would you give me a 5-star about it?
DR said something that caught my eye. We were talking about, conversations and podcasts where you remove the boring stuff. She said where boring stuff should be removed. Is there a place where boring stuff should not be removed? I was like, you always want to remove the boring stuff. So that caught my eye. And then,
but hold on, boring is in the eye of the beholder. Like, what may be boring to you may not be boring to someone else. That doesn't mean this is such a gray area, because humor is subject to who's listening, right? That kind of humor that they like. So I think, this may be boring to you. Even as a consultant, you may say, this isn't that interesting, but there may be an audience that really, really likes the boringness. We talk all the time. I think we gave advice for a lot of years, 20 minutes on the podcast. And yet there's all these really good podcasts that are 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
Do what you need to do on this thing, and don't Yeah, you know what? If you think it's boring, then stop doing it. But if you find it interesting, I bet somebody else is going to find it interesting too. So don't let that. This is Dave. This is the kind of stuff when we say these kinds of things. This is the kind of stuff that actually keeps people from podcasting because they're like, well, someone said it's going to be boring, and man, I'm afraid to put this out there because I'm going to get judged for it being boring. So I think podcasters, be careful what you say to folks who are starting this kind of thing because they're sensitive to it, and they're just because you think it's boring, other people may not.
Well, yeah, I've listened to shows where I remember one, it was for military people, and they just went into so much jargon. It was like, oh, back when we did the KM-27 and the thing, and then the double captain, and I was like, okay, this must be really good because I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So, but
if you listen to a group of military guys and ladies talk to each other, you may not understand it, but they are in perfect sync.
And that's where I go, I'm not your target audience.
Right.
It's boring to me, but I'm not the guy you're trying to reach. So keep that in mind too. So if somebody says, like, when I hear somebody mention how somebody's audio is bad and I didn't think it was bad, I'm like, well, what do you do in podcasting? Like, oh, I'm actually a professional engineer. And I'm like, that answers that question. So always consider the source. Yeah, I did a review once of a toy train. Guy was doing a podcast about toy trains. I never had a toy train. I had a sheltered life apparently. And but Eric, this was on the podcast review show, Eric K. Johnson did. So Eric was really into the show, and I was like, yeah, it wasn't bad. I'm not the target audience for that. So keep that in mind. So Michael Ray has a quick question. Would it be possible to put a local news RSS feed on a website? Yes, you can put any RSS feed on your website. Now, if it's copywritten or things like that, that gets icky. To get an increased traffic for a local business. That's a head scratcher. A local news RSS feed. Because the RSS feed, like you can put an RSS feed into WordPress and it will take the items in the feed and make them into posts. But then you get into the whole weird Google duplicate content thing. I was like, if you're trying to increase traffic for a local business, write a blog post about them and put it on your website, because otherwise you're going to end up with everything in that feed on your website. So SP says, how's the summer cycling working out? Yeah, I have cycled a couple times. Today, normally this would be a biking day. I'm driving to Cleveland. I used to live near Cleveland, just to go to a park that is like one of the coolest places to hike. They have a thing called the Stairway to Heaven that I call it. I don't know if anybody else does. And if I remember right, it's 136 steps. So I'm going to get my Jim on, right? Jim Cullison, who loves to climb stairs and do that. It's just a fun thing to do. So, but no, I need to cycle more. Been doing a lot of walking.
Well, yeah, just walking is good enough. 136, that's pretty good.
It's a lot. You just keep going up, and then you turn, and there's another thing, and it's right on the edge of a cliff, which is great. So it's
pretty good.
Yeah. We just answered that. Coach Dave, I am taking over a podcast. The feed is a mess. You want to take a is a mess. I think that might be an autocorrect. It's faded. I made a pod page and a survey. Thinking move the feed to 301 and redirect, a clean break with a new season, new artwork. Yeah, if it's a mess, see if you can. We'll see if you can import it.
You have any idea how many people are still attached to the feed? Because if it's a mess and it's been a mess for a while, it might be easier just to start over. Just to be honest.
Yeah, you could redirect it, and then whatever was looking at that.
Yeah, you could.
That would work. Make sure you've got something. Make sure the feed you're redirecting to has at least one episode in it. I've seen people do that. They'll redirect it to a feed and they haven't started the podcast yet, and that's not a valid feed. And people think it's broke because they went from having episodes to none. And so at least have an episode there. But Daniel's done that. Daniel in the past, actually, somebody had their URL was up for auction or something like that. So Daniel bought the URL and redid that. So Heather says, "Hey, Jim." Hey, Heather.
I said, "Hey, Heather."
Oh, there we go.
I went over to LinkedIn. It's crazy because this is the things I don't like about StreamYard is I would love to be able to get LinkedIn comments. I keep the Google chat open. And just this week, I thought, I should probably be on LinkedIn when that happens. We'd ask folks to let folks know they were listening on Twitter as well, and I'll retweet that. So I've been trying to keep that chat room open as well so we can respond to those kinds of things. But Heather, thanks for joining us.
Yeah. DR says, unless I'm missing the first part of this comment, no, meaning that there are too many people not giving value, have run out of stuff to say, but continue. That's my favorite.
They can, though. That's the thing. We shouldn't judge them for that. Just don't listen to it.
Yeah,
this is the crazy thing. Why do we complain about other people doing these things? Stop listening to it and go listen to something that is interesting, right?
Vote with your download.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
If they want to do that, we always say anybody can start a pod, anybody can do a podcast. So DR, I'm not trying to be hard on you, but I think we do this oftentimes as podcasters. We make, hey, anybody can do it. And then we judge them when they do. And you're just like, hey, you don't have to listen. No one's making you listen to that stuff.
I always love when people are like, did you hear what Ben Shapiro said on his show? I'm like, oh, so you were listening? They're like, well, if you want him to go away, quit listening to him. He will quit doing it if his vote with your ears. Exactly. All right. So, and yes, DR says, I'm crushed. No, she's not.
Not really.
So I have a question, but we're going to do something we've never done on the show. We're going to tease a topic for next week.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
I saw this. I saw this and I was like, you know what? We got 3 minutes and I have lots to say on this. Thanks to my lovely 2 divorces under my belt.
Yeah. Experience. You have lots of marriage experience.
I do. But Ian Antonio in the podcast movement group is asking, hi, everyone. How does podcasting affect romantic relationships? I've been thinking about that. And I was like, oh, I have lots to say about that. So that'll be in next week's Ask the Podcast Coach. Now you can go to askthepodcastcoach.com/follow and follow the show and never miss a fun-filled episode. So that's coming next week. And we do have time for JD's comment, which says, I understand what you're saying, Jim, but there are some things that are objectively boring and uninteresting and should be cut.
Not true. But I know he's joking. It's not true though.
Well, so there's nothing boring. Okay, so name a show you don't like.
I don't know. I don't listen.
Well, you don't listen to them. That's true.
Everything's interesting to somebody at some point in time for something, right? I mean, that's such a judgment call that shouldn't exist. It's just like, let it be. You don't have to let it do its thing. Just let it be. It's fine. It's fine. Listen to the things you're interested in.
But that goes back to that person that was scared that nobody would listen. Somebody's going to listen. I made a show called The Worst Podcast Ever. It was in a grumpy old man voice. Yep. I purposely made the audio as bad as I could, and I still got 10 downloads. Yeah. So I always say, if you're getting less than 10 downloads, there's a problem. You might want to check your technology.
Bernie the cat. Bernie the cat is a great example of.
You know what? Let's Bernie the cat has not put out an episode in a very long time.
I loved Bernie the cat
due to the fact that he is dead. So I think I have like one Bernie in the can. Of course, I could make more. I've got all these recordings. So if I go to Bernie the cat, he's here somewhere, which I believe if you go to Bernie the Cat Show, okay, in the last 7 days, he's had 4 people listen to the show. In the last 28 days, he had 10. So, there you go. So if you want Bernie the Cat, I think it's Bernie the Cat Show, if I remember right, because somebody had BernieTheCat.com. I'm like, how dare you? How are we doing? Okay, we have a minute.
Yeah.
For one last question.
I love this question.
I have a biz podcast that recently rebranded it. It used to be for creative entrepreneurs, but I have now niched down to content creators. Any tips on niching down? Go to Amazon and look at 2- and 4-star reviews, because those people will give you more information than this sucked or this was great. So they'll explain why. I would have given it 1 star, but they did talk about this. I would have given it 5 stars, but they didn't talk about that. go to YouTube, look for your topic, and then read the comments. That'll give you some insights into what the audience is looking for. Because aren't content creators mostly entrepreneurs? That's a good question.
Can overlap. Those can overlap.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, Jim?
It gets harder when you niche down. So you have to get more passionate. You have to become a greater expert on that, and you run the risk of repeating when you're, because you're just narrowing the field on which things that you can talk about. Now, I think there's a greater reward in that because you're going to attract a smaller audience to it. It's just the way it's going to be. Smaller doesn't, 100,000 people is smaller than 1 million people. So but still 100,000 is a lot, right? But it's just naturally going to attract less people. So I think you got to change your mindset going in, saying, okay, I know that I'm limiting my audience on this thing. And so, but when you limit your audience, you have the propensity to get greater engagement. So do things this is where like meetups, like in person or virtual meetups, those kinds of things work. Or the Patreon models of paid engagement for certain things. Those work better in a niche or niched down situation. So it just changes things a little bit. You have some opportunity for personal engagement, which I don't think you get on a big wide podcast. You can, but it can be a little bit better that way. But just realize it's going to take a little more work, and may take a little more work, may be a little bit harder in the process.
Yeah, because you say it's for the biz side, it's for monetization. That sure sounds like an entrepreneur to me.
We don't have enough information, to be honest, in a comment to know.
Well, the good news is we'll be here next Saturday, same time, same time. Ask the Podcast Coach. You can even go to askthepodcastcoach.com/question and actually jump in. The video is optional, but we'll have to do a little vetting to get you in. But would love to talk about that, and then we'll talk maybe next week about how to make sure your spouse doesn't go, "Are you podcasting again?" That's not good. Jim, what is coming up on theaverageguy.tv and over there at Home Gadget Geeks?
Yeah, I took the week off because I was busy doing this work podcast, and it's always nice to kind of get away from that. But if you want to go back and listen to it, we got some episodes. Check it out, homegadgetgeeks.com.
And on the School of Podcasting, this kind of fell into my lap. I did a video for the School of Podcasting, and I go, "What is it's a tip, but it's not a course. Like, what do you call these?" And they're like, "Common podcasting mistakes." And I've done that in the past, but I came up with about 4 that I've not talked about in the past. One of them we kind of talked about today with feeds. And so we'll be talking about some things you might want to avoid with your podcast on the schoolofpodcasting.com. So thanks to the awesome people in the chat room. As always, it's always great to answer your questions here live. If you go to, I'm hoping this is right, if you go to askthepodcastcoach.com, the bottom right-hand corner, there is a microphone there. So if you're listening to this going, "I can never make this live because I lived in wherever and it's 4 a.m, feel free to leave your question there. We'll be happy to answer it on the show. And be sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you get notified when we go live. And Coach Dave is like, "We do not have enough thumbs up, so do that now." Thank you so much. We'll see you again next week with another episode of Ask the Podcast Coach. Tell a friend.